I'm Deanne Pizzica. You've probably seen me around already. I'm a tester, and I have been since about 2004, when I sort of fell backwards into this profession. And I started out working for this man here to my right as an executive assistant. And I kept refusing project work. I started working for this little custom software shop, and I didn't really care what they did because I was just there to, pick up the mail and answer the phones. And then suddenly that sort of devolved or improved, depending on your perspective, into project work. And I started testing on custom applications. And so since then, I've done more training and more learning, and I'm on career path software, as I like to say. So that's me.
Hi, I'm Manuel Mattke, and I'll apologize for my weird voice, which has to do with an AC-induced cold, so sorry for that weird tone. So, Manuel Mattke, we go way back to 2004 in the software context when I was running a company I founded. I now run a different company, which is a consulting firm focused really on product and program innovation. And most of the programs and products we work on are technology related. To give you an example, we're developing a whole program right now for bringing Android tablets with curriculum content into several developing countries where it's too expensive and inefficient to ship lots of textbooks and sort of printed materials. And so we're in charge really of the entire piece, not just the software development or just the hardware procurement. So the focus there is very much on innovation and sort of courageous ways of trying new things. Because I have a software development background and now work with a lot of software groups and testing groups, we thought this would be an interesting topic to pick up.
All right, so without further ado, into our presentation. So in this session, am I really going to read a slide? We're going to talk about this relationship, and that's the main goal, right? So we as testers have an interesting and tumultuous is the word we called out, relationship with upper level management. And this was sort of hit on in some earlier talks and that have been around the conference so far. And so we want to dive into that because we think it's a really interesting relationship that could be improved in a lot of different ways. And so we have some ideas on how to go about that. So we're going to propose 7 ideas, actually. That's very specific. So in order to improve the relationship and the communication between people like us.
So looking at it maybe from the business end of things, what I've found with every project and every product I worked on, that ultimately the kiss of death comes very quickly when we don't care about customer experience, user experience for the products. And it may not just be technology companies, pretty much any company can't afford to give their customers a poor experience with whatever their product is. Now, I know this is a bit of a loud and provocative statement, but the way I've always worked with testing groups and the way I look at them is that they keep me as a business person safe when it comes to my product. Before my product hits the street, I have a group of people who really are the ambassadors, but also the representatives of the customer more than anybody else, more than the designers, more than my product chief, more than my marketing people, more than my developers, the tech team. And so to me, I look at the testing team really as, and guarantor is maybe too loud or big of a word, but I look at them.
We are the gauge of quality. No one gets past us.
And not just in the sense of, oh, it's not broken, but really in the sense of this is a product that I can issue on the street and that will help my business go. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of the overarching premise that you'll see in a lot of these ideas that we'll come up with.
But so we have this idea that the testing team can guarantee and keep our upper level managers safe and honest, right? But there's a lot of problems with that, right? And so we've listed out some of these things that you've probably heard, right? And sometimes they come in a whiny tone, right? But we only come in at the end. And if the dev team actually did what they were supposed to do and delivered on time, and then we've got outsourcing, and management doesn't understand what we do. Nobody listens, right? We stand up and we say, I need this and I need that, and we're not heard. And so, this is good that we can't afford testing people and let the developers test, right? And they do unit tests, so we don't need actual testing, right? So we wanted to hit on some of the stereotypes that come out in the conversations that I think you've probably all heard in some way. Do any of these sound familiar? Anyone? Oh, I see at least a couple of nods. All right, that's good. So in spite of all of that, we want to look at, well, what can we do to get past all of that stuff, which isn't really useful, right? And get on to how do we promote productive conversations? So.
Yeah, and my take on that, and I'll try to tell some more stories around it, is both in my own experience building product in various incarnations, but also in advising usually CEOs of various size companies, sometimes CTOs, around this question of how to construct their testing effort and sort of where it fits and how it fits. So we'll hopefully have a few stories, and I'm assuming you will all have some as well that we can talk about later in open season. So to me, when I think about testing, I think it's a really hard job for these three reasons. It comes usually at the tail end when everybody else has burned through their deadlines and only a little bit of time is left, and yet the business people say it has to be released on that date. So suddenly our time is shorter. The focus is typically on things that are broken, which is organizationally, sort of from the communication dynamics, not a great story, and we'll talk more about that later. And it takes a lot of time. And so those things don't connect very well together, and which is why, to me, it's such a hard job, and yet it's an incredibly important job. So this is a little bit the backdrop from me and for both of us when we think about how do you fix a situation like that when you find yourself with this predicament.
Right, and so here, that's where we get into, our well-broadcasted 7 ideas, right?
So this first one is one of my favorite ones, and it's the fix the org chart, which clearly is not an easy fix by any imagination, but it's an important one. And that is that I've seen in many organizations that the testing team reports to the CTO or fits into the development infrastructure, the technology infrastructure. And with every company that I've worked with, and certainly my own, I have always been a strong advocate to saying the testing team should live in the product group. And what I mean with that is some companies have a chief product officer, say, some companies don't. Sometimes the CEO stands in for that, depending on size. But there's usually a group that thinks about market research, that thinks about design, user experience, features, monetization, marketing, all those pieces. And to me, testing should live in that part of the world, because that's where the ideas come up as to what should this do for our customer? How are we improving our customers' lives? And to me, again, going back to my loud statement earlier, if the testing group aligns with that and understands how that group thinks, it's a very different story. They end up testing very differently. They end up understanding the requirements, the priorities of everybody on the business side a whole lot better than when they're sitting over in the technology stack, sort of dealing just with the developers and developer-related issues. That doesn't mean there isn't a lot of communication between those two. But to me, I found when those changes were made, they were powerful. And just to give 2 quick examples, a large dating site, 4 million plus users, made this shift. And what happened is, because the product group was very marketing focused, testers began to understand the application functionality from the eyes of marketing and the customer, how we're trying to sell to the customer. And their whole focus on how they were planning and thinking about testing shifted to a much higher value perspective. And I was very happy to see that. Another company, it's a online news organization. The product group is run by people who think mostly about design and sort of the user experience from that angle. And once we move testing under that group, again, you got a different kind of alignment than before when they were sitting under the development group. And what happened was, when they were under the development group, the bar was very low. It was like, is it broken? No. Okay, fine. Whereas as soon as it moved to the product team that had this design orientation, it's almost like they started looking with different eyes. And they started seeing things that before were never even on the radar as issues, but that really matter to the overall monetization strategies that the design team and the product team were pursuing. So simply by moving the group to a different area of interest in the company, we found huge change and huge improvement of value in what the testing team did.
Right, and from my perspective on this, I've been a tester, and I've considered myself a tester for a long time. And recently, through no choice of my own, and I shudder to admit that I now think it's probably a good thing, I was changed. My title was changed, and I am a senior business analyst. And I was like, what? I'm not a business analyst. Those aren't my people. But what I found is it changed my involvement and on the project, and it changed not necessarily the way I look at the product and what I can do for the customer, but it gets me in the door a lot sooner, and it gets me a lot closer to the end users a lot sooner. And I thought at first, like, I used to think that my neutrality and coming into the project without being loaded with a lot of information was very valuable and added a unique and again, more neutral perspective to what I do. But I found that the more business knowledge I come loaded with into a project and the domain knowledge I have about a system I'm testing increases the quality of the information that I can report back, and it improves the way I report it. Because now I'm thinking about, well, this kind of launches into the next slide, which is the customer experience, right? I'm channeling what the customer does. So you know, focusing on that experience. So now, in that perspective, I've got, you know, I'm loaded with all kinds of business knowledge. I'm also loaded with, I'm very fortunate to work in a custom app world. I know most of my end users. Sometimes personally, right? I've talked to them, I build relationships with these people. And so when I'm working on software that I know they're going to use day to day, it means so much to me to be able to make their lives better, right? Because the product I'm working on is something they're gonna use every day, not me, I don't use it. So focusing on what's really gonna make something better. And it gets into the idea of, I'm gonna fumble on who I should attribute this to, but you know, you get into these ideas of quality, right? All these quality definitions, and Duran with fitness for use, and you know, there's implied specifications, and then there's the explicit specs. And sometimes the things that we're reporting are totally outside the spec, and it's totally outside of the realm of what the designers had in mind. But once you have it in your hands, you are just full of knowledge and feedback about how something should work and what you want people to experience. And to be able to do that kind of testing and offer that kind of value just completely changes the game, right? So
maybe to augment that further, and to use one or two examples, there are several cases where we were engaged to help a company fix a product, maybe save it or maybe kill it, depending on what was necessary. And I can think of two cases where the testing team basically did the work they were supposed to do, but in the larger context, the product was tanking, and people were trying to figure out why. And ultimately, what was happening is that everybody from the product team, through the tech team, through the testing team, ignored the fact that the user experience was really poor. It was just not a great product. And yet, internally, everybody's like sort of singing from the same sheet and convinced that they were doing the right thing. And it sort of goes back to, is the testing team keeping me safe as a business leader in the organization? What really was necessary, and what we did, is to push very hard on the testing team there to say, look, channel a customer, stand back from everything you know and all the agreements you have internally. Stand back, pretend to not know anything, and use this again and test it again, and tell me what's really going on. And the story that came back was very, very different once we sort of divorced them from the internal knowledge. So I agree fully with everything you're saying, but you know, want to push it to the next level to say when you actually step away even from the business knowledge you have and just sort of pretend to be one of the customer segments that's being targeted, you get some interesting results. And to me, yes, the product group should do that, the designers and all the rest of it, but the testers really should do that because it's going to make their work a whole lot more interesting and a lot more productive.
Absolutely. Risks. All right, so when you're thinking about how to get started in testing, risk analysis is one of those major things to focus on, right? So there's all kinds of risks, and there's different ways to look at them. And one of the things that I always like to know, and I got this, I was first exposed to this idea when I was at CAST in 2007. I attended Rob Sabb's just-in-time testing tutorial, right? And it was mind-blowing. He was like, well, just interview people, like talk to everybody. And I thought, well, that's so simple. It makes so much sense, right? So one of the first things I do before I start any testing effort is I get my hands on every stakeholder I possibly can at every level, because I want to understand what's most important to all those different types of users. And then you can take those things and rank them, right? Because you need to prioritize, because if the idea is test everything, well, you can't test everything. There's never enough time, there's never enough budget. So you have to make choices, and they're all about trade-offs. And I think there aren't enough productive conversations that happen at the management level. Like maybe you get some ideas from the project manager, and certainly you should be getting ideas from developers about things that they're concerned about. But are we taking it to marketing, and are we taking those questions to management and saying, like, well, what do you really need? What's your objective for shipping? Like, at what point and how much do you need to have to start moving forward and presenting this to a customer? And what deadlines are you committing to that you're not telling me about? And those sorts of, like, difficult and challenging conversations about choosing how you prioritize things, and then to make that your first objective when you're testing.
Yeah, in a lot of these conversations that I've been in, the focus was never on, will you give me a perfect product? Because we all know that it's not going to be there. For various reasons. One, we don't have enough time, we don't have enough money, we have all sorts of constraints that we're living in. And that applies to everything in the business, including testing. So my question to the testing teams, and the questions of other executives around me, and the ones I coach, I sort of push in that direction, is always to say, tell me what areas in this product I should really worry about. Because we're not going to test everything. We can't test everything, and in many cases, we don't even need to test everything. So for you to come and tell me about all the regression tests you're going to run, in many cases, I may devalue that, because looking at the risk profile of the next release, I may not care about a bunch of the regression tests, simply because I don't think the application is affected by what just happened. And so having a really intelligent conversation that isn't about, here are the miles of things that we need to do, but to say, here are the areas of the product that I, as a lead tester, say, I'm really worried about, and here's why I'm worried about them, and here's what I want to do to mitigate that, is huge. Mm-hmm. The other piece is to be really intelligent around sort of how to assess, how to mitigate the risk. Again, we may not have time to test every possible permutation, so let's think through which of the ones we actually care about. There may be edge cases that fall off the table. And then there's a discussion. If I really want to ship tomorrow, well, I may not get all my edge cases, and I may be fine with that, actually, for various reasons. No, seriously. And because we're making these kinds of trade-offs all day long in every part of the business, not just in testing. So I think understanding the risk well, and then having the really open, crucial conversations with business stakeholders around what those risks mean is very, very helpful, I think, and opens the conversation at a very different level.
Absolutely. And I think that goes into our next slide, which is timing, right? So one of the biggest problems we run into is, again, we get our stuff as testers at the very end of the release. Everybody's burnt out. The developers have been working late every night, and half the stuff's broken. And so, again, when you understand the risks you're trying to mitigate and what the thing, once your priorities are set, it's clearer on what to focus on, which just helps with timing. One of the things that I have found, and it sort of flips this a little on its ear, is my team is a Scrum team, and so we work in 2-week iterations. And so then, instead of focusing on how many days is it going to take for you to do that or anything, everything becomes about trade-offs, right? So we're managing multiple projects from multiple customers, which is a little anti-Scrum, right? And how do we prioritize all of these various things? And the reality is you can't fit everything that everybody wants into a sprint. And so if time is constrained, then now it's all about being prepared, right, to actually talk about what you can reasonably accomplish in a 2-week time frame, right? And being really open about, well, we can probably do this, but we certainly can't do that, and having those tough conversations to say, you're not going to have this, and you're not going to be able to ship with this feature because there's just no way to look at it, or the other trade-off of, and this is a dangerous trade-off, and I can't even believe I'm going to say it, but right, there might be things that you're not going to test them, right? Because you shouldn't test if you don't have any, like, if you're not going to do anything about the test results, then what's the point of having the information? Right. So again, those are different trade-offs you might consider, and of course it depends on the context, right? Isn't that what I'm supposed to say here on the context-driven stage? So it's all about your project context. Anything you want to add on timing?
Yeah, and it really relates to the risk assessment. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, timing gets imposed for all sorts of reasons that may have nothing to do with the product or the product team or the technical team at all. And so I have found in various organizations when I had testing leads who were in those conversations, in the business conversations, in the design conversations, the customer and marketing conversations, and they understood what the priorities were across the organization, they could come back and say, I understand what you're trying to do, so I understand the timing that you want. Here's what I propose we do. And usually it ended up in a negotiation where maybe they got more time than I or somebody else wanted to give, and they probably got less time than they wanted. But because it was an open conversation about timing as opposed to this sort of weird thing of how many days is it going to take to test, whatever that means, we actually were all in the same boat as opposed to on the other side of the table. And as a result of that, my overall philosophy on these timing issues has generally ended up saying, once we have those kinds of conversations with the test lead and I require them, I will then accept whatever your estimate is of timing, as opposed to imposing a timing on whoever I was working with. That sometimes didn't work. I would say most of the time it worked very well, actually. And I think the testing team, as a result, didn't feel like I was just jamming something down their throat, or whoever was running the business in that moment. But there was a collaboration going on where both sides felt they understood the other's requirements, both gave a little, and the end result was acceptable.
Well, and I feel like sometimes those conversations don't happen, right? The test team doesn't always know what the business timeline is, right? That information doesn't make it to us. But in other cases, and so I'm also working on this project that Manuel talked about with shipping tablets off to these kids to learn curriculum, right? And there's a major constraint, right? These physical devices must make it into the hands of these kids by a certain time. And so all the software has to actually be ready to go so that it can all be installed in that certain timeline. And there are trade-offs that happen with development and with testing in order to make all of that happen. So, again, real tangible constraints. So.
I would say just to add one more piece to that, what I found really critical is to have a really good testing lead who could think with us. So the situations where we'd outsourced to a team that wasn't even our team in India, Vietnam, Philippines, whatever it was, where it was very hard to have that dialogue. So one example I had with the team in India, basically the only answer I could ever get from them was, yes, we will make it. And they never did. But they would never say, no, you are wrong, this isn't going to work, here's what we need to do. And, you can compensate only so much for that. So having a partner on the other side who's willing to say no, who's willing to stand up, who's also able to have that conversation instead of just sort of throwing Excel sort of spreadsheet test plans at me and saying, this is what we all need to do, was really, really critical in terms of how the team is constructed.
Yeah, absolutely. Ooh. Be a positive voice.
This is one of my favorite ones, because back to one of the earlier points, and I'll exaggerate for effect here.
He called me whiny, okay?
I learned this with my kids, that if I constantly criticize them, at some point they stop listening. And I think it's a little bit like that in the testing culture as well. If most of what we report is sort of negative in tone of, hey, you're supposed to deliver this thing and you broke it again, even though you were supposed to make it right. If that becomes the pattern of the dialogue, which is sort of baked into the relationship, unfortunately, it gets hard. And I've been on the other end of that as a developer, even where you just don't want to listen anymore because it's too patterned, the dialogue. And it's hard, on the other hand, you don't want to feel like you're stroking all these people all the time and, oh, you did such a great job and you worked so hard and all the rest of it. But understanding that communication style and approach to it may go beyond the facts. The facts may be whatever they are, that you have 900 bugs that need to be fixed by tomorrow. But the style and the tonality and the tone that we use to communicate, especially coming from the testing end, is probably 80% of the game or more.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and this is one of the first things we teach in bug advocacy, right? If anyone has taken that class, it's all about being polite when you're reporting your bugs. You never want to tell someone that they're stupid or that they did something wrong, they've ruined everything, So it's all about how you address something in a professional and productive manner. And when dealing with people on your team, remembering that everyone's got a common goal, right? We all want to have a good product. I had a really good idea somewhere when you were talking, and I totally lost it. Oh, curses. It was something different. It wasn't part of my notes originally. All right, well, it'll come to me or it won't.
Well, just to add to the piece, so earlier, maybe you'll remember while I'm going on. Earlier, we talked about the whole question of being more involved in, so say, a product area, really understanding business requirements or business constraints. What I found is when testers and test leads begin to think about the product more holistically than just, I'm supposed to test this piece and here's my test plan, I'm going to execute it and hand it in, the conversations shift. Because sometimes testers would come and say, so I tested it, it works fine, I think it's still bad. And suddenly we're having interesting conversations that are about the product and about the customer ultimately, and not just about here's the list of broken things. And I found that the people who did that, who could communicate that, started to position themselves differently in the organization and were listened to differently than the people who sort of just chucked a lot of bugs at people. And so, this isn't career planning advice at all, but there's an aspect to the fact that I could really see the difference where those people who, even if they had long lists of bugs, if they framed it and contextualized it in a way that ultimately was positive, was about the customer, about the business, gave them a very different standing in various organizations I've worked with than the others who did not.
Right, and so I did think of my thing. So in a simple way, and adding on to the how do you phrase things and how do you put things in a positive and constructive sort of sense of criticism, there are also simple things that often we're asked to provide, like reports about the testing that we've done and what we've accomplished and what's finished. And instead of just providing that long list of this is broken, check out these 12 bugs in the issue tracking, but to also include some of the things that have been tested and thoughts on, hey, well, this feature is in good shape. We could ship with this if we had to, and to be proactive in thinking about the product as a whole and what are the things we're doing that already work that can be handed over to customers and stuff at that point too. So including, again, it doesn't have to be like, hey, crazy sunshine, but this idea of like, these are the things that are working and this is the positive experience that's going on with this product.
And I've seen that example where a tester would come and suggest a shift in scope to actually accelerate shipping. And many times people thought that was a great idea because suddenly we realized, you know what, if we take this thing out, move it to the next sprint, it's almost there, the next sprint will be fast, and yet this release will be stabler. And somehow nobody thought about it, but the testing group did. And it was seen as huge value.
Win for the testers.
So don't whine. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Oh, this one's all you.
So I'm a huge fan of test automation in various flavors and colors. And one thing that surprised me over the years is how little excitement I got out of my testers for this topic. And I got a lot of stories of why it was too hard, it would take too long, or they didn't know, and where to start, and all the rest of it. And I still don't quite get that, I'll say. To me, test automation is a huge opportunity for all the testers I've ever worked with. And I have worked with some that were really phenomenally good at it and who helped actually shape an overall strategy of getting us to release more quickly, to release a stabler product. And I have a particular view on where automation works and where it doesn't work, and I'm not going to go on into it now. We can talk about it later if you want. But my overall recommendation sense is to say there's a place for automation and then there's a place where automation doesn't help. And And I have always looked to the testing group to say, come and give me a strategy. Think through what our automation strategy should be with this product, with this time, with this circumstance, this amount of money, and this level of knowledge in the room. But a testing group that doesn't have a strategy and can't even help me as a business person frame one is a really poor situation, and one that I think is sort of signals to me that I have to make changes and find different people, simply because I can't afford paying the tax of every regression test for years to come that only gets more and more and more and more, and it's really not that high value work at some point. So I really look to a testing group and a testing lead every time I step into an organization, or everyone that engages us, is to say, it doesn't have to be a big strategy, it doesn't have to be fancy, it doesn't have to be like 99% coverage, but you should have a view on how to do it. You should have a view of what you want to cover and why. What's the benefit of it, not just because. And there should be some growth going on within the organization for people to learn, simply because I feel more and more, if you really don't know about automation, even as a tester, I look at that as less value, where somebody who comes in who has automation background capabilities, we may or may not use all of it, but it speaks to me to somebody who's growing and learning and expanding into an area that has significant business value.
Right, and for me, I pawn this off on Manuel, mostly because I am not an experienced technology tester, right? Automation isn't my wheelhouse. I think it's awesome if you know how to do it. And I would welcome someone on my team who was very skilled in that way. But it's always that balance. And for me, like, when we talk about the customer experience and the value that comes from that, I would love to have the checking out of my way so that I can focus on the nitty-gritty testing stuff. But because I live in a manual structure, for me personally as a tester, I do a lot more checking than I would really like. So from that perspective, I'd love to see more automation to get all that out of the way. But
now, automation's become more and more complicated also now that we're testing for various device types, various screen sizes, responsiveness, whatever. So again, the piece I would emphasize is less the immediate outcome of a very high level of coverage on anything. As a business person, the huge value for me is to have a strategy around it as to why we would use it, where we would use it, and also how the team will grow to pick it up. And in pretty much any company I've worked with in the last 10 years, we would take at least one person and say, go figure out automation more so that we have an in-house expert and we're not just hiring the consultants from the outside all the time. And every single time somebody did that, they were kind of overwhelmed, they kind of struggled with it because like, oh, do I have to be a developer to do this? No. And every single time they also came back and said, this is really interesting stuff and I'm really enjoying what I'm doing. I'm having fun with it. I can't tell you that I can implement it all, and my take's always fine, but at least we're now moving as opposed to pretending automation doesn't exist.
all right, and dun 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 dun, idea 7. So this is engage early, right? Get started, get into the project as early as you possibly can. Is our big idea, right? It's not a new idea. I shouldn't say that, right? So the idea of being like, when you come in at the end and you don't have any knowledge of what the priorities are, what the risks are, if you haven't been involved in the project up until now, you're at a great disadvantage. So the sooner you get involved in the various parts of working on the product, then the better off you're going to be, the sooner you're going to find important bugs, right? Get things reported sooner, they get fixed sooner, and everybody's happy in a faster way. You run into the danger of looking at testing things before they're ready sometimes, which is again getting into trade-offs and how you do management. But I think in the theme of talking about important conversations and collaboration across a team, both from the tester level up to the management level, the sooner you start having these conversations and the sooner you start engaging the people in the project, the better advocate you're going to be for your customer and the better product you're going to have in the end. And I've just found being that part of, having that level of involvement instead of taking a big old requirements document at the end of the release and saying, okay, what do I do with this now? Being able to have those conversations sooner has I feel, made me a stronger tester.
Yeah, in many ways, this whole topic and conversation exists only because there are a lot of misconceptions, I think, between the business side of most companies and the testing side of companies, leaving the technology piece out of it. And the perspective I've often seen in many of the companies that I've worked with is that testing is seen as sort of a mechanical thing over there. It's a tax we have at the end. It's not an intelligent thing, but we just sort of have to do it just to get there, as opposed to thinking of it as a strategic advantage. And the reason, there are many reasons, and they're on both sides for sure, as to why they exist, but I would say one reason often is that testers come in too late at the end. They ask all sorts of questions that you think, why are you asking me these questions? And the focus is mechanistic of I'll check the list, I'll go through the test plan and knock it off, and then I'll hand it back and say you have so many bugs. That's one issue. The other problem, of course, is if you're testing, you have a full-time job. You can't just go over there and suddenly be a business analyst and talk to the marketing people and sort of have this interesting field day of discovery before you do the testing work. I've had some interesting cases where one of the test leads that I had actually was a software developer, and a good one, who went then offshore and led a testing team there. So he sort of had cross-functional abilities. And the testing that they did as a result was tremendously better, because just sort of by orientation, he was wired to think beyond the box that he was in. And he did engage early, because he wanted to see what the requirements were that developers were building to. Early on, he wanted to be in the discussions when new features were debated and discussed over in the product group. And so this notion of transcending, if you will, the box of we're just the tax at the end, and more to say, for us to keep you safe as a business and to ensure that you're really issuing a product that works for your customer, we need to understand what the designers are thinking. We should hear from the marketing people, even if it's just a lunch hour summary of what the marketing plan is for the next release. We should hear from the software development team of where they're putting emphasis and why and how that works. And I found every single time we did that, testing went from this sort of mechanical tax at the end that nobody wanted to deal with and that everybody sort of jammed into the small time box, that suddenly they were the partners that kept us safe from beginning to end, because even during design and requirements, people would say, oh, by the way, it doesn't work that way. And you, as the business analyst, don't remember because you're not actually in the application deeply enough, but I am as the tester, and I can tell you, this is actually how it works. And those conversations become iterative in a super valuable kind of way. And so this notion of engaging early as a testing team all the way to the beginning, not just with test planning, but with the whole discussion and debate of what the product will be like, was hugely valuable. Now, you have to sell that to somebody because you're spending time, obviously, in ways that aren't sort of on the job description necessarily. But I actually found that it was generally an easy sell because it sort of makes sense when you think about it.
Well, and I think part of, the stereotype of being thrown in at the end, right, you're reactionary at that point. But if you're positioning yourself to be bold and to be prepared and assertive in how you involve yourself on your team, then I think you're better positioning yourself to be involved early. And in some ways, you have to, force your way into meetings and talk to more people on the team to start getting the inside scoop from folks and,
Right.
like, hey, wait, can I come in on that one too? Like, oh, you're discussing that. Like, I think I might have something, and, and to just stop by people's desks and see what they're doing. And that sort of, if it's not being handed to you, then you need to find avenues to sort of wheedle your way into the process sooner. Big finish, right? So as we think about wrapping up in our overarching themes for our big ideas, right? We want to channel our customers. We want to think about what their needs are, their level of experience, and providing them the best service that we can. I think as testers, we are major service providers for all of our stakeholders. So
You could even say testers are the customer, because again, nobody else in the organization will think like the customer. The tester actually has the opportunity to do that. And to me, that's always the message is, I don't care what the test plan says. I don't care what we've all agreed amongst ourselves. Go out there, back away from everything you know, and just be the customer and test that way. You may skip stuff that's on your test plan. You may do things that aren't on the test plan that you've figured out. That's a much more valuable test to me than if you're just sort of going down and checking off the list.
Absolutely. And then, crucial conversations, right? We talked about this a lot, this idea of keeping the conversation rolling between, your team members and especially your management level and your tester level. And don't be afraid to start questioning things and to say no if that's the thing that strikes you. I'm a people pleaser, so my first answer is always yes. That's terrible. Unless it's my kids, and then my first answer is no before they've even finished the question. I was like, oh, you were asking for an apple. That was totally reasonable. But anyways, but to be bold and to jump in and not be afraid to have those conversations that might be a little bit uncomfortable. Oh, I'm still gonna go, huh? So business priorities. This is all me. So just understanding what your various stakeholders are looking for and understanding how to prioritize those things and to focus your time effectively on the various stakeholders that you're serving. And that ties into your risk analysis stuff too.
But on the business priorities, that to me is really the key piece that shifts the conversation away from we're this mechanical group that bangs through test plans to we're a partner, just as everybody else is in our environment, to help create a rock star kind of product.
Mm-hmm. And then the last bit is to lead where you can, right? To if you see an opportunity to start jumping in and innovating within your organization, to find those things and follow up on them, and to be proactive and bold and assertive, and to be a thought leader within your team. So. All right. So now we welcome questions and open season. We've given you a nice summary of our ideas, the better for tearing them down. And I think I need to give up my mic, right?
No.
Oh, you're good. Brilliant.
I have one microphone, and I have to run it around myself. So it would be very useful if you who are in the further back row to come up in the first 5 or 6 before we get started with this. And if you're further back, I may neglect you somewhat.
Nice.
We don't want that. Come closer.
So, I haven't collected anyone's cards yet either, so please keep them up until I get them, because I will be running around like here. So I've got 193, 84, 120, and usually I don't prioritize the front of the room in calling you, but there's a different set of incentives at play here. So you'll run the mic for me? Okay, great. Make sure you
Woohoo! Thanks.
put it on. Take a couple minutes to warm up. Okay, so I've got 193.04, 120.66. I've got 30. I've got 92 and 199. And 185. All right, that's everybody initially. So let's start with 30. And when I call your number, please hold your card up again so that my mic carrier can find you. Thank you.
Good job, Mike Curry. All right, so as I understand it, and I apologize, I came about 2 minutes late. As I understand it, you guys moved testing into the business, is what I was gathering. What that usually means is that there isn't an ability to test earlier as pieces of the system are coming available, because the business testers are usually not technical. Therefore, you end up with potential for pent-up defects, kind of latent in the kind of a big bang handoff
Right.
to the testing process over there in the business, because there wasn't opportunity or skill set or whatever to engage earlier, small and early testing as we've done it. So I'm just curious, has that happened? Have you seen that effect?
I've seen a different effect, and that is that it forces that division to go away. Now, another solution is that you sort of divide the testing team. You have the business testers over there, the technical testers over there, and these people sometimes are more developer type, and these are people more of the business testers. I have generally seen the result be, though, that suddenly the conversation between technology sitting over here and the business sitting over there and the product group somewhere sitting in between become more fluid, because we still needed to have the discussion roll at that same time, because the big bang handoff results also in a peak, what I'd like to call the peak of panic, in terms of hours that suddenly spike and everybody's unhappy. So that would be my perspective on it, actually, that it has opened the conversation earlier and kept the early testing in place, even though it's across organizational boundaries.
Another card on the same thread, 132.
So we actually,
Oh, you gotta wait for the mic so the internet can hear you.
we do still have our testing group within the IT group, but we also have an organization where the boundaries are exceedingly low. And so there's a tremendous amount of communication and involvement between customer experience, customer care, support, marketing, product management, and the testing team. What we've found, though, is that by having them be more involved with the business and the business discussions, is we've also moved the development, like they do design reviews literally before a developer even writes a line of code. They do implementation walkthroughs every 2 weeks. And so getting that feedback really early on, even if they're not doing formal testing, actually gets to the point where when you release, and when we're in our release sprint, that's almost anticlimactic, because by that time everybody's seen it so many times, they all know what it's doing, and it ends up being a very positive experience.
And especially if you're living in an agile world where you're trying to go faster and faster on these cycles, the organizational boundaries have to become diffused, because you just don't have time for the formal handoff meeting and then the return meeting, all that stuff, which is all good in that world as long as the communication works. Maybe another point, though, to where is testing located. It also depends a lot on who the product head is and who the CTO is. Because in some cases you may say, we have a CTO that actually can manage that group better and has the mindset that's right. Unfortunately, I've seen a lot of CTOs where they don't, which is why it's better to move it over there. But you can also have a product head who doesn't really get quality in the same sense, where you may be better off with this. It's not like a one-size-fits-all in every organizational size either.
Briefly recapping staff. When you're standing where you are and speaking this way, you lose the mic.
Sorry.
So it's all right. So I'd like you to all pull up your cards as I say who's coming next, so that my mic holder will know where you are when I call you. The next three up are going to be 120, 185, and 193. So those are where the mic's going next. Right now it's going to 120.
Uh-oh, not that guy.
I'm sorry. So something that we're currently dealing with, and I actually happen to work for a company where we have a pretty good alignment with organization where we're small enough. I mean, we're a subdivision now of a larger company as a smaller company that was acquired by a larger company. Whole nother discussion, not going there. One of the things that we are looking at, though, is because we started from a smallish test team and built into a larger one, and most of us are veterans. I mean, we've been around a long time. We know quite a bit. We all have different domain specialties, and we're actively working now towards, becoming, leading the thinking on automation, so to speak. What we found, and we're working towards doing this, and I've seen this in most organizations, is that the biggest challenge you get is that unless you have somebody on the team either already or you actually hire somebody whose core focus and competency is going to be creating, maintaining, doing whatever is necessary for the automation to go forward and be stable, it's usually going to collapse. We're fortunate in the sense that we do actually have a dedicated person who that is their primary 100% role, and we're all coming in and being mentored by that person to get stronger and understand our particularly hybrid stack of things that we do to do automation. It's not an off-the-shelf solution. It's very tied to our product. Anybody who came in as, oh yes, I'm an automation expert, they'd struggle big time to be able to catch what we do, just because it's evolved over many years. So I think it's important that we actively encourage that and spreading those skills, because that expert may not always be around. Have you yourself, how have you gone about your automation procedure? Have you deliberately gone out to hire a guru, so to speak, to be the core, with the idea that you were going to spread it out to the rest of the team for, you know, long-term support?
What I have seen, so I have in my own circumstances not done that recently. However, I know several companies that I've worked with where they wanted to expand the testing team, and that was made a top priority for that same reason. I think your point's incredibly well taken, that if you just sort of stick some automation on and the person leaves or whatever and nobody else knows how to maintain that, it's hard to live with. So my sense on that is that over time, you might have more people focused on the automation than sort of the exploratory or leading edge testing to maintain that stack. And then people sort of rotate to the front edge of it, in part because it's fun and it's interesting. But the bulk of the work ought to be covered ultimately by automation, meaning that you need a bigger team to do that. So I think what you're describing makes a lot of sense to me. And my only add-on would be to say it's probably not going to be just one guy, but over time, the majority of your team will migrate that way, and then sort of cycle through the manual testing for various reasons that are good for people and for the business.
We're going to go to 92, but first a brief reminder, the mic wants to be your close personal friend. It needs to be well inside your personal space at work. So, 92.
So I kind of follow on to that. For automation, I hear you talking a lot about how you want to bring automation in and effectively replace or add to a lot of the testing, or supplement the testing with automation that effectively does the testing for them. But the difficulty that I've had talking to people who work in that kind of an environment where there's that executive push for it is the most effective means of automation many times isn't just replacing testing with that, but it's something that there's a disconnect at the executive level where automation doesn't need to replace the testing. It's many times replacing actions or workflows as part of testing to supplement it. Adding testing tools that speed up our testing or allow us to gather additional information. Mm-hmm. And I guess the question part of this probably would be, what's the best way to try to communicate that to the executive level to understand that information? Mm-hmm. Because that seems a difficult message to get across.
I think there's a huge education disconnect in the business part of most companies when it comes to automation, that either it's sort of this nirvana thing, we just push a button and all the testing gets done, that's great, we can fire the whole testing group, which makes no sense at all, obviously. Or it's sort of more of the complicated variety. Other people also say, well, why don't the developers just do all that? And then, again, we don't need the testing. So I would agree with you. It's not just about replacing people. To me, it's also not, you can't test all the new stuff automatically anyway. So both augmenting and replacing, whatever the framework may be, ultimately comes down to me to this piece I was talking about earlier, what is our automation strategy? Because every business, every product has a different angle on that, has to have a different angle on it. There is no one size fits all. Down everything from the platforms to what we automate, how we automate it, what pieces you have to wire together, how that gets maintained. And so what I always ask for, or ask the executives I support to ask for, is let's first think through what actually the right mix of manual testing and automation is and what the automation should cover. And let's have the strategic discussion first, what that is and what value comes out of it for the business. Sometimes it makes us faster. Sometimes we can over time erase an enormous regression testing rig that requires just too many people and is too expensive. who knows what the objective is? So I don't think there is one reason, which is we want to get rid of manual testers. It really relates to business objectives that have to do with time, with money, with flexibility, with product rejuvenation, whatever it may be. And so starting with a strategy that doesn't just involve the testers, but where the testing team leads and comes in and says, here are tools that we could use. Let's have a discussion of how those could actually make our product better, make us faster, and help our financial position. And what is that conversation like? It involves the product people, the technical people, and so forth. And I think once you start with that strategy, then you develop something that fits in the right context. And the executives on the other side of the table are in a conversation, not just sort of hearing this techno stuff from over there. I don't know if that makes sense.
So I just finished going through this in my project, and I'm working with a VP who's very supportive but doesn't understand QA.
Yep.
She knows technology really well. Two great development managers, the front end and back end, but they have the same kind of view of automation is a thing, a single automation
Right.
strategy. And so education became a really important piece of this, so breaking it up and saying there isn't a single thing that is the automation. The other was to also step back, and because there's a tendency to focus on the tool and then you do what the tool can allow you to do,
Right.
rather than saying, what are the challenges we have? So where are the places where our regression testing is taking way too long, or we can't possibly cover all the combinations? And I started from the business challenge of this is where testing costs us the most, and worked backwards to figure out the tools and figure out the strategy from there.
Mm-hmm. We had several product examples where my objective wasn't even to get a lot of coverage, but was to say, let's find 5 things that we can automate purely for people to gain experience and experiment. It had no value to the business in a bigger scheme, but it was interesting, and it gave us a better view out of practice instead of out of reading stuff on the internet to say, how might we do this? So it was almost a precursor to developing a strategy.
Just to ask a question, actually, of you, Manuel. This is me over here. Don't look out there. If I'm a tester and I want to engage you in a conversation about automation strategy, how much level of detail do you want to hear? Like, Manuel and I go way back, and he knows I'm really good at rambling stories, right? So, like, I know this is personal, but like, what's your threshold as a CEO for how much detail you want from a tester in a strategy to start off this conversation? And does it help you if I come with things in writing, or, you know, like, what can I do to help facilitate this conversation? And automation is just an example, right?
Yeah, I think that there are many ways to get at that, but to me, the one that matters the most is to talk to me about outcomes. Don't talk to me about inputs. And to the extent that you can sell me on the outcomes, you'll have a lot of latitude to figure out what the inputs are. And all too often the discussion is, about, like you said, it's about the tool, or it's sort of one thing over here, as opposed to a business conversation of how we will do better with our product, with our release cycles, with revenue, whatever the heck it is. And as long as we talk about that, it's an interesting conversation to the business side. Okay. And then, you know, what the inputs are becomes much more flexible.
Right now, one more card on the stack. Please feel free to hold up additional yellow cards, but I'm pausing it after this so that we can get to the 6 green cards we have remaining on the stack. So we're going to go to 92 on the same thread, and then we'll be heading to 185 and 193.
And I just kind of wanted to follow up on what you had said. Part of the idea of what I said and kind of what I heard from you is this isn't necessarily, when you approach this, it shouldn't be about not just the tool, but also executives many times will focus on run my tests with tools. My point in asking how to communicate this was, in large part, many times the testers that I've heard from that are struggling with this they use automation already. Mm-hmm. It's not to run the tests, though. It might be generate data, or it might be determine what's the best thing to target. Mm-hmm. So where executives tend to focus on how can I repeat those actions with a tool instead of a human, even to free up a human to do the exploratory testing or the interesting testing. And as you mentioned earlier in the talk, to do checking. The difficulty is many times it's on execute the test or do the check or to examine the application under test. And many times the biggest bang for the buck, at least in my experience, is largely from figure out where my pain point is in my workflow and figure out how to make that faster. If that's with a tool, great. It might be a process change, something like that. But in my experience, the biggest bang for the buck comes from talking about where my pain point is and then talking about the solution with tools on the table as an option, but not necessarily where aren't we using tools that we should, but where are our pain points that we should be solving.
It gets at the risk analysis piece. If you can focus on where we're most likely to fall down and how tools can help that, I think that conversation goes a whole lot better than when it's, again, sort of about all the inputs of the machinery we want to use or whatever.
Thank you. 185.
So I'm curious, how did you get so smart about testing? And how can and more importantly, what needs to happen for the C-suite in the entire world to get smart about testing, and entrepreneurs and VCs and board members, right? It's just, I'm amazed to hear everything you have to say. It's wonderful. I'd love to hear it from more business leaders.
Have whiny people be like, Manuel, you need to have office hours so we can talk. Not just being pithy. There is a little truth to that.
Thank you, first of all, but it's a really interesting question, and ultimately I think it comes down to how the testing, first of all, again, where the testing work is located. Is it just sort of a subservient thing behind the developers? In too many organizations, the developers are the rock stars because they make the thing, and everybody else is sort of, bring them food, kind of. And so to me, selling the fact that, and I got religion early on this somehow, that who knows what they were doing. I mean, they were committing all sorts of crimes over there. Unless I had a really good testing team to keep them honest and me honest, who knows what was going to happen. But I think that story is often not sold, in part because testing is buried under a CTO somewhere who's getting them to bring food to the developers. Or because, again, the focus of testing is too much on the mechanics of it instead of the sort of business value strategies. And this gets to the crucial conversation part. I think, we have to tell a different story to the C-suite that isn't about inputs, but is about the value that comes out of it, or what happens when you don't do it, when you don't do it well, when you're not thoughtful about it. And then to actually have those crucial conversations, to go and say, I need to talk to you about how you're using your testing team today and what value you get out of it, and how you might use it and what kind of value you would get out of that. And it's not about how many bugs we fixed or all the rest of it. It is ultimately how we think of our customer. And if the C-suite begins to see the testing team as the ambassador of the customer and the stand-in for our customer, because only when you're building custom software can you actually call your customer and say, hey, test this out for me. In most cases, especially large-scale applications today, you can't. And the only people who can do that are the testers. And I think once you sell that story, the C-suite, I've seen in many organizations, people actually get it. It's sort of like, oh, why didn't I think of that earlier? But somehow the conversation never connected.
We've got 10 minutes left. I'm going to 193 now. And after that, the people who can be thinking about the question again are 199, 84, and 66. And that's the whole stack. So if you thought I had you and I don't, now's the time to act.
I wanted to go back to your second point about the customer experience and making that the focus of your testers. Because during that point, you then mentioned that your outsourced or contractors really struggled with that. Yet that seems to be where most business people want to go. That's their pitch. Like, oh, we need to get this tested. Let's outsource it and get it, just throw bodies at it.
Yeah.
So how do you reconcile those two things?
The whole throw bodies added to me is a delusion. And I had an interesting example with one project where people were very proud of the fact, this is actually on the development side, but it holds on testing as well. They were really proud of the fact they were paying developers $27 an hour for PHP development in Vietnam. So this is good. Let's see how that works out. And then I started analyzing invoices that were coming back. And it turned out, and sort of compared what they got done with their $27 an hour and how many hours they actually billed for that work. And at the end of the day, the effective hourly rate of each of those developers was probably $80. But the pain in getting them to actually deliver what they were supposed to deliver was like 3 times as much than the onshore team that on an FTE basis sort of cost the same, or maybe a little bit less. So the approach that has worked in a number of organizations that I've seen is to have a test lead either here in the US or offshore that came from the US, that is there, that crosses the cultural divides and differences very well and has a good communication channel. And I found when you have that combination of people who are matched to the culture where the development is and where the business is, and augmented potentially by more people in whatever country it is where you're outsourcing to lower cost, the results tend to be better. They just sort of throw people at it offshore and we'll see what comes. In the end, I have found every single time the quality is relatively low because it tends to be a mechanical approach to testing. And the costs, in the end, aren't that different. Yes, they're lower, but sort of by the time you've actually done it enough times to get it right, you've actually spent more than you ever thought you would nominally.
Yeah, in my organization, we're kind of facing the same issue. We're working with the team in India. We have 10 people working offshore. But what we did in that scenario is we brought 2 of them here in the very beginning and trained them and worked with them. One went back, one stayed here, and then every 6 months they traded places. And we're slowly bringing others from offshore into the U.S. office to work. And they're really understanding the product and the paradigm and so forth. And we found that's been very, very effective. So something you might want to try. That's a great approach, but it reflects something that is different from the let's just throw bodies on it, which is somebody was willing to invest. Because it's expensive to fly people here and house them here and all that, and you have to bank on the fact that they'll be around. So that's a great strategy because you're acculturating both pieces, both sides of the cultural end. But it required somebody to get religion and say, I'm going to invest in this because it matters, as opposed to just give me more bodies in India or somewhere else.
New thread, 199.
I just wanted to share a story about focusing on the customer experience. The company I started at, they had no QA department, so they had designers that would do the wireframes, and then it would be developed. The designers were doing the QAing, as they called it, at the end. So when I came in, I told them they didn't need to look at it anymore. They just needed to kind of let go. And there's a kind of a big problem that they had an agreement with development that development would not push back on any requirements. So development would just do whatever the designer said, and they would kind of iterate on production customers. So I thought that was horrible, and one of the first things I did was, I complained about some usability issue. And they were like, oh, we have this agreement that we're not going to address those until we iterate on it next sprint. And so I really had to push the idea of, I am your first customer, you must placate me. So, I said there's 4 outcomes here, or there's 3 outcomes. One is you address my concern. One is, you can convince me it's not an issue. Another is you can create a story for next sprint to handle it, just so I know it's not kind of forgotten. And I'm like, the one thing you can't do is dismiss me. So, and that's kind of a big point. Other people mentioned about being assertive as well, is that, these are important issues for us to address, and we need to make sure that we kind of uphold them as we do it as well.
And did that work on your team? Were you well received?
For that particular person, it took him a couple more weeks, but in the long run, yes.
Okay, good.
Congratulations.
You want to fight.
I'm going to make this reasonably quick because I've talked plenty. Early in the slide deck, one of the things that stuck out for me is the tester as a guarantor. And flashbacks to an earlier time. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
I told him that was going to cause trouble.
I was hoping somebody would complain about that. Again, as I said earlier, it's a loud word. The concern that I have with too many development organizations is that we all sort of begin to drink the same Kool-Aid and the customer is actually far away. And if there's nobody who explicitly takes that on and says, I will throw myself on the railroad tracks pretending to be the customer, and you cannot release this thing for real reasons, not just because it didn't pass some requirement, but because I understand the customer segments that we're selling to, and I'm impersonating one, and I'm speaking for them, I'm channeling them, and I get it. Nobody else will. And I'm dealing with some products right now where everybody agrees that the usability is fine, and I look at it and say, I can't believe this thing is in the market. And nobody was there to raise their hand and say, we cannot put a product like this out. And so while guarantor is too loud of a word, because obviously you can't force the development team to do what they should be doing or the product team to change requirements, when somebody in the organization takes it that seriously to say, I owe it to my customer, it's my customer. I may not be the CEO, it's still my customer. Once that mindset sinks in, their voice becomes powerful in a very interesting and new kind of way, in a way that I really like, because we all sort of delude ourselves into, oh, it's going to be fine, or we'll fix it in training, or whatever it all is, or we'll put a video out and they'll figure it out. And they usually don't. They just abandon the product because it's not good. So that's why I like to put a really high bar on that, because with that mental model, the behavior changes.
There is one thing I want to caution about that, though. You can't stand up every time and say, you can't ship, it's not good. Because if you're constantly seen as that person who's barring progress, right, and you're not picking what battles are truly important, now you're risking your credibility. So you also have to remember where things are from your earlier discussions about priorities. You know, what are the battles you really want to stand for? So that's just another cautionary note. Be bold, but don't be stupid, you know?
Just generally.
Just generally, it's good advice for life, right? Oh, Anne-Marie's making her own cards. I love it. Let's talk about innovation.
That is good.
Oh, wait for the mic.
We've been having a bit of a Twitter war about this topic. And,
oh, I'd love it.
Not a war, a discussion. And so one of the comments that came was that this could alienate, the testers from the developers. So if you're so focused, if you've got the product, if you're now in the product team, the devs aren't going to see you as equals, and you're going to create challenges there. So I just wonder what your thoughts are about that.
I mean, I think in general, right, your team should be aligned so that you're always working together, right? And one of the things I work really hard at doing is I work very closely with a lot of the developers. And I think one of the things to do is to always remember to be polite and be respectful, because I think your developers are going to be your greatest source of information in a lot of ways about what you should be looking at in the product. When I start working on any new feature, there's one developer in particular, right? I go to him and I'm like, okay, what'd you work on? What did you look at? What are you worried about? What are the things you think I should be looking at? And that's where I start a lot of my investigation, because I think they offer a tremendous insight. And great developers can provide you all kinds of testing information, and most of them are really happy to talk about it. So I would be worried about a disconnect between the test team and the developer team. But I think if you remember how to play nice and don't make it an us versus them thing, I don't think that needs to be a problem.
To me, it comes back to the customer. Developers, and I'll raise my hand because I was a developer once, don't care much about the customer in general. There are lots of exceptions for sure. But in general, we're more interested in writing good code, talking to our machine, talking to each other, whatever. So having somebody who fights with me on equal ground, even if we are somewhat more separated than we might be because they're sitting in my back pocket otherwise, is a good thing. Because it's in the name of the customer, not because we're now more powerful or less powerful, because that person represents the customer to me, and they're supposed to channel that voice. And to the extent they do, it's annoying to me maybe because I don't know that I want to deal with that, or I'd rather push it off and say, oh, they'll figure it out. But that's what should happen. There should be greater tension in some ways around this question of, are we really making this right for the customer? And you look at products like Facebook, the first mobile app from Facebook was sort of I don't know who let that out, but it was a really poor product. But somebody did. And I think there wasn't enough tension there, aside from the fact Facebook claims they don't have testing. But there wasn't enough tension. And so I actually think more tension is better, even though there's also collaboration required. And as long as it's in the name of the customer, I think it works very well.
So we've gone 3 or 4 minutes over, so we won't be able to have any more discussion time. You can break out and have a real discussion or come harass the speakers in person. But thank you all for coming, and